On November 12, 1998, Flight 714 plunged into the Atlantic Ocean, exactly 78 days after an unknown analyst mailed a sealed letter predicting the exact minute of its destruction. When federal agents smashed down his apartment door 12 hours later, they found his coffee still steaming, his car idling in the sealed garage, and zero physical trace of the man himself. What was waiting on his desk would shatter everything investigators believed about time, murder, and the terrifying reality of why he vanished. The story begins in late August of 1998. An ordinary, quiet man named Arthur Vance walked into a local post office in upstate New York. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't an executive. He was a low-level data researcher for a regional logistics firm. He handed the postal worker 6 heavy manila envelopes. Each was stamped with urgent red ink. Each was addressed to a major news outlet. Inside those envelopes was a single sheet of paper. It contained a single sentence: Flight 714 will suffer catastrophic electrical failure over the North Atlantic on November 12 at precisely 4:17 a.m. All 214 souls will be lost. At the time, nobody paid attention. Newsrooms receive hundreds of strange letters every month. 5 of the producers threw the paper directly into the trash. Only one young clerk at a national syndicate tossed it into an archive drawer marked unverified. For 78 days, that paper sat in the dark. Then came November 12. At 4:15 a.m., Flight 714 was cruising at 35,000 feet. Skies were clear. Systems were normal. At 4:17 a.m., radar screens across the eastern seaboard went black. The plane vanished instantly. When search teams recovered the flight recorder weeks later, the physical cause was confirmed: a sudden, catastrophic total electrical failure. Exactly as written. Down to the exact minute. How could a low-level analyst know this 3 months before the aircraft even took off? That single question launched one of the most intense federal manhunts in modern history. By 3 p.m. that same afternoon, federal agents had tracked the origin of the letters directly to Arthur Vance. They assumed he was a terrorist. They assumed he had planted a device. They were prepared for a standoff. They surrounded his quiet suburban apartment complex. Tactical teams took position on the roof. Snipers targeted the windows. At 3:14 p.m., they breached the front door. Inside, the apartment was warm. A mug of coffee sat on the kitchen counter, fresh steam rising into the cold room air. On the living room table, a television was playing the breaking news report of the crash on a continuous loop. Agents swept the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. Empty. They moved to the basement garage. Downstairs, Arthur's sedan was parked in the center. Its engine was running. The exhaust pipe was sputtering carbon monoxide into the enclosed space. The driver's door was wide open. The driver's seat was cold. Arthur Vance had not driven away. He hadn't walked past the perimeter teams outside. He had simply vanished from inside a sealed building, leaving behind a running car and a hot cup of coffee. But the strangest part was still to come. Search teams began a microscopic sweep of the apartment. They pulled up floorboards. They dismantled the walls. In the master bedroom closet, hidden behind a false backboard, they found a simple wooden desk. On top of the desk sat a heavy reel-to-reel audio recorder. It was plugged into the wall, its red light blinking slowly in the dark. Beside it lay a pair of heavy studio headphones and a handwritten logbook. An agent put on the headphones and pressed play. What came through the speakers sent a wave of icy dread through the room. It wasn't a recording of Arthur talking. It was ambient noise. Static. Wind. And then, clear as day, the sound of an altitude warning alarm chiming in a cockpit. The voice of a pilot screamed through the static, "We've lost all primary power. Mechanical failure in the main bus." The audio matched the cockpit voice recorder of Flight 71 for word. Here was the impossible detail: the tape in Arthur's closet was dated September 4th. He hadn't just predicted the crash in writing. He had an audio recording of the cockpit terror 2 months before the flight took off. How is that possible? A sabotage plot couldn't fake a cockpit recording months in advance. A bomb couldn't predict the precise words a doomed pilot would scream into his mask. The lead investigator ordered an immediate, deep-dive background check into Arthur Vance. They looked into his bank records, his childhood, his employment history. They expected to find a genius engineer, a disgruntled aerospace worker, or an insider with access to classified military tech. Instead, they found nothing. Literally nothing. Prior to 1995, Arthur Vance did not exist. There was no birth certificate. No tax records. No high school diploma. His social security number belonged to a child who had passed away in 1962. Every single piece of his identity was a meticulously constructed ghost. He was a man who had dropped into the world out of nowhere 3 years prior, taken a mundane job, and spent his nights listening to audio from flights that hadn't crashed yet. Now, pattern interrupts began occurring in the case file every time investigators thought they had a lead. They checked his office computer at the logistics firm. His hard drive had been wiped clean using a high-grade military overwriting protocol, technology that wasn't supposed to exist for another decade. They interviewed his neighbors. They described Arthur as a polite, quiet man who never had guests. But one neighbor recalled something strange. She said that every night at exactly 3 a.m., Arthur would stand by his living room window, looking up at the sky, holding a small brass instrument to his ear. She thought it was a radio receiver. But she noticed he never turned a dial. He just listened. If you think this was just a lucky guess or a rogue Black Ops project, what investigators unlocked next will give you chills. For days after his disappearance, forensic technicians managed to crack open a heavy steel safe hidden beneath the floorboards of Arthur's garage. Inside the safe, there were no stacks of cash. There were no foreign passports. There was only a metal box containing 5 yellow envelopes, identical to the ones Arthur had mailed in August. Each envelope was sealed with heavy wax. Each had a date scrawled across the front in black marker. The lead agent picked up the first envelope. The date marked on the outside was January 16, 2001. He opened it. Inside was a detailed report describing a sudden, catastrophic collapse of a major bridge in South America, complete with the time of collapse and the precise structural failure point. Remember, this investigation was happening in November of 1998. The agents locked the envelopes away in a top-secret evidence vault. They classified the entire file. They told the media that Arthur Vance was a suspect who had fled the country. They buried the story. On January 16, 2001, at 2:14 p.m., a suspension bridge in South America suffered a catastrophic structural failure. It collapsed at the exact minute recorded in Arthur's locked envelope. The details were 100% accurate. Panic rippled through the top tiers of the intelligence agency handling the file. This wasn't a criminal case anymore. It was an anomaly that defied every law of physics and human understanding. How was Arthur Vance obtaining this information? Was he intercepting signals through time? Was he receiving transmissions from somewhere else entirely? Or was he something far more terrifying, a visitor who knew the exact timeline of human history because he had already lived it? Agents reopened the cold case. They went back to Arthur's empty apartment. They tore down the drywall. They ripped up the concrete foundation. Underneath the garage floor, where his car had sat idling on the day he disappeared, they found one final item buried in the dirt. It was a small cassette tape labeled with a single word, explanation. They rushed the tape to a laboratory. They digitized the signal. The audio began with heavy, rhythmic breathing. Then, Arthur's voice spoke. His tone was cold, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. If you are listening to this tape, his voice echoed, it means the timeline is intact. You are looking for me, but you are looking in the wrong direction. I did not cause these events. I am simply a recorder. He paused. The sound of atmospheric static buzzed in the background. The machine I brought with me is failing. The static is getting louder. By the time Flight 714 hits the water, the bleed-through will be complete. I cannot stay in this year any longer. The door is closing. The tape recorded 3 final, rhythmic metallic clicks. Then, Arthur spoke his final words, check the envelope dated October 29th, look at the names. Look at the last one. The tape cut to loud white noise and ended. The investigators rushed back to the classified evidence vault. They pulled out the remaining envelopes from Arthur's safe. They searched for the one marked October 29th. They opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a list of 8 names. The first 7 names belonged to high-ranking federal agents, scientists, and analysts who had worked on Arthur's investigation over the past 3 years. Beside each name was a precise date of death. Every single one of those 7 people had passed away unexpectedly between 1999 and 2003, from sudden illnesses, freak accidents, or unexplained heart failure. Then, the agents looked at the 8th name at the very bottom of the page. It was the name of the lead investigator reading the document. Beside his name was a date. It was tomorrow's date. The lead investigator dropped the paper. He walked out of the vault. He packed his bags, resigned from his position instantly, and vanished into total obscurity. He survived that day. But to this very hour, no one knows where Arthur Vance came from, how he knew the future, or where he went when he stepped into his garage and vanished into thin air. Was Arthur a traveler stuck in the wrong time, desperate to leave warnings before his equipment failed? Or was he something far darker, an observer watching a tragedy unfold, knowing he couldn't stop it? Leave your theories in the comments.